everybody. I want to begin today a little bit different than I normally do, and it's by reading you a story, okay? And one of the things that I want you to know about the story that you're about to hear is that it is true. It is verified by professional medical people and many corroborating witnesses, all right? So listen to this. It starts, Barbara's surgeon declared Barbara was one of the most hopelessly ill patients I ever saw. Barbara was a budding gymnast in high school, playing flute in the orchestra, but symptoms began appearing. She would trip, bump into walls, and was unable to grasp the rings in the gym class. Eventually, after her condition worsened, the diagnosis of progressive multiple sclerosis was confirmed. Over the next 16 years, her condition continued to deteriorate. She spent months in hospitals, often for pneumonia, after being unable to breathe. One diaphragm was paralyzed, rendering a lung non-functional. The other lung operated at less than 50%. A tube was inserted into her neck with oxygen pumped from canisters in her garage. She lost control over urination and bowels. A catheter was inserted into her bladder and a bag attached for her bodily waste. She went legally blind, unable to read, and only capable of seeing objects as gray shadows. A feeding tube was inserted into her stomach. She needed continuous oxygen, and her muscles and joints were becoming contracted and deformed because she could not move or exercise them. Mayo Clinic was her last hope, but they had no recommendations to help. By 1981, she hadn't been able to walk for 7 years. She was confined to bed, her body twisted like a pretzel into a fetal position. Her hands were permanently flexed to the point that her fingers nearly touched her wrist. Her feet were locked in a downward position. Barbara entered hospice care in her home with a life expectancy of less than 6 months. One day, someone called in Barbara's story to a radio station at Moody Bible Institute in Chicago. A request was broadcast for listeners to pray fervently for her. Some 450 Christians wrote letters to her church saying they were lifting up Barbara in prayer. On Pentecost Sunday, 1981, her aunt came over to read her some of the letters which people had offered for her healing. 2 girlfriends joined them. Suddenly, during a lull in the conversation, Barbara heard a man's voice speak from behind her, even though there was no one else in the room. She said, the words were clear and articulate and spoken with great authority, but also with great compassion. The voice said, "My child, get up and walk." Seeing that Barbara had become agitated, one of her friends plugged the hole in her neck so she could speak. "I don't know what this is, but you're going to think about this, but I just believe that God told me to get up and walk. I think he really did." Barbara felt compelled to do immediately what she had been divinely instructed, so she literally jumped out of bed and removed her oxygen, standing on legs that had not supported her for years. Her vision was back, and she no longer was short of breath, even without her oxygen. Her contractions were gone, and she could move her feet and hands freely. Her mother ran into the room, dropped to her knees, feeling Barbara's calves. "You have muscles again," she exclaimed. Her father came in, hugged her, and whisked her off for a waltz around the family living room. That evening, there was a worship service at Wheaton Wesleyan Church where Barbara's family attended. Most of the congregation knew about Barbara's grave condition. During the service, when the pastor asked if there was any announcements, Barbara stepped into the center aisle and casually strolled down the front. Well, people started clapping and then spontaneously broke into Amazing Grace. The next day, Barbara came to the doctor's office for an examination. Seeing her in the hallway walking toward him, the doctor said, "I thought I was seeing an apparition. No one had ever seen anything like this before." He told Barbara, "This is medically impossible." A chest x-ray that afternoon showed her lungs were already perfectly normal, with the collapsed lung completely expanded. The intestine was reconnected normally, said her surgeon. She was restored to complete health. Barbara has now lived for 38 years with no recurrence of her illness. She subsequently married a minister and feels her calling in life is to serve others. Both physicians marvel at her extraordinary recovery. Quote, "I have never witnessed anything like this before or since, and considered it a rare privilege to observe the hand of God performing a true miracle," said her doctor. Now, I read that for a few reasons. One reason was obviously that's really, really cool, okay? Let's just start right there. Remarkable and kind of awesome and all those things. But I also read it because what we've been doing over the last few weeks is we've been in a passage in the Bible and we've been studying it for a purpose. We've said that if you're a Christ follower, you are an ambassador for Jesus. He names you that. And we've even tried to have you read a statement to reinforce that. Think of yourselves as ambassadors for Christ. And go out into the public, think of yourselves that way. But what we've been doing is we've been looking at a passage in the book of Matthew where there's this pivot point where Jesus has been teaching and preaching and healing, and he gathers up his immediate followers, and he changes the mission. He says, I want you to go out and do this now. Here's how that passage sounds. Just a piece of it says in Matthew chapter 10, Jesus called his 12 disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out impure spirits and heal every disease and sickness. As you go, proclaim this message, the kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give. Now, we've been trying to extrapolate different principles from that about being ambassadors, but this passage has kind of this elephant in the room feel to it that we've not looked at yet. And it's the whole thing of healing and miracles. So I think it brings up two questions. Number one, is that stuff really real? You see, in our post-enlightenment world, in our skeptical minds, and I'm sure some of you are skeptical at all about that. Yeah, I absolutely believe in that stuff. And when the Bible says it, sure, I believe it and it's great. Others of us, if we're being really honest, and I'm one of those people, I live in the scientific age. We're 21st century thinking people. And what happens is when you read a passage like that in the Bible, is it consciously or unconsciously can create a greater chasm between our world and their world. Because it talks very openly about this kind of stuff all the time. So it does beg a question, are these things real? Now the second question is, even if you were to come to the conclusion they were real, is that our assignment? You know, what's that mean to us? Are we supposed to go out and heal the sick and raise the dead and all that sort of stuff? Are we called to that? So what I want to do today is I'm going to talk very directly about both those basic questions and try to give out some answers and give you some things to think about and hopefully challenge some of our ideas about how all this stuff works, all right? So the first thing is, are these things real? Is that chasm real? And the way I want to do this, and spoiler alert, yes, I think they are, but let me present, I'm going to give you a little bit of evidence, all right? I'm just going to kind of go with some evidence. Now, Exhibit A, I'll present it that way. Exhibit A was that story I read at the beginning. Now, the reason I love that story, besides the fact that this is a remarkable thing, this is not one of those things where somebody had a backache and felt better after someone prayed. This is about someone who was down for 16 solid years, had not walked in 7, was in hospice care, okay? That's important to know. This was something that was absolutely, and the doctor said, medically impossible. Now, that's the other thing I love about the story, is that it is corroborated by evidence. The surgeon and the doctor have both gone on record writing books, and they are, to add to that, they were doctors at Mayo Clinic. For those of us who think scientifically and those kinds of things, these are Mayo Clinic physicians who have gone on record saying, yes, this happened, I saw it, it is not made up, okay? That's very, very profound. But the other thing I also like about it too, the family is from Wheaton, Illinois. I was up in Wheaton, Illinois not very long ago. It's just 6 hours north of here. This is a good old Midwest. It's not in a jungle somewhere. This is in modern times in the good old Midwest. I think that's important. So that's Exhibit A. Exhibit B, I'm going to give you as a resource, and it's a book. It's a book by a man by the name of Lee Strobel. Lee Strobel wrote a book called The Case for Miracles. And Lee Strobel, one of the reasons I love him is because his journey was, he was educated in law at Yale, and he went into being an investigative reporter for the Chicago Tribune for many years. And his wife becomes a believing Christian. He thinks she's crazy because he's an atheist, and he wants to get rid of the Christian thing in her life. So he uses his investigative skills to try to prove the Christian faith false, and in the process becomes a Christian himself. And so he's been writing books called The Case For a number of different things ever since. Case for Faith, The Case for Christ, The Case for the Creator. And his latest one is this one called The Case for Miracles. And I could not recommend it more highly. We're going to offer it in our Explorer area at our campuses. Fantastic book on this subject. Now, one of the reasons I love it so much is because he's a skeptic. He thinks like a skeptic. He's a believer, but he still remembers what it's like to think as a skeptic. So the book travels through the eyes of a skeptic. For instance, he does interviews. That's what he does. He's an investigative reporter. It's not just his thoughts. His first interview that he does is with a guy named Michael Shermer. And Michael Shermer is a professional skeptic, quite literally. Michael Shermer is the publisher and founder of Skeptic Magazine. And he founded an organization called the Skeptic Society. So in other words, he really is. And he just lets Michael Shermer throw every shot he can at miracles. Why don't you believe them? And he just piles up all these reasons. And it'll mess with your mind. You read the chapter. The guy makes some really, really good points. And then Lee Strobel travels around the world and around the country and talks to authoritative people, very, very smart people, about Michael Shermer's objections. That's how the book travels. So that's Exhibit B. Here's Exhibit C. In the course of the book, Lee Strobel interviews a scholar from over in Wilmore, Kentucky. It's just outside of Lexington, which is UK country. Those of you in Henderson, this guy has to be an expert. He absolutely knows what he's talking about, right? He's over at Asbury University, and his name is Craig Keener. And Craig Keener really is truly respected as one of the foremost authorities on the New Testament era history in the world, by whether Christians or not Christians. He is an amazing scholar. Well, he published a book not very long ago called Miracles. And what it is it is an in-depth study. And when I'm talking in-depth, I'm talking exhaustively in-depth. One scholar said this about him. He said, this is another scholar who read the book. This is perhaps the best book ever written on miracles in this or any other age. Another scholar chimed in and said, you don't need to say perhaps. It is the greatest work on miracles ever done. And the reason is because he goes back to the New Testament times and he talks about all these things. And then he literally got on planes and he traveled all over the world because he had heard of miracle stories and he wanted to talk to people face to face and test these things out. The story of Barbara came from Craig Keener. He actually sat down with the doctors and interviewed them and did that kind of stuff. That's how he knows those things. And I also want to let you know, it is an 1,100-page book. I have it on my Kindle. I don't have a hard copy, but this is an 1,100-page book, all right? This is the average size book that most of us read. It's about 175 pages. This, not this, okay? And the thing about it is, he is painstakingly thorough, all right? So I'm reading through this book, I'm like, wow, okay, dude, you can hustle up. I get it. He documents everything. So if you are a true skeptic, he documents and documents and documents and documents and documents to the point of distraction, okay? So what I want to do is I would like, kind of during this question of, are these things real, sum up 1,100 pages, the best I can, but just giving 2 points from it. His essential thesis is this. First of all, there's not a chasm between our world and the world of the New Testament. And the reason he says that, he goes into the logic of it, he goes into philosophy, but his main thing is the stories that you read about in the New Testament, if you will do the history and you will study history, the stories sound the same through history, especially in the modern times. He literally traveled all the world to Africa and South America and India and Malaysia and China, all over the world. And he says the stories sound the same as they do then. There's no break. It's not some chasm world. You have to understand that. Let me give you one simple example. This is from India, and he kind of files them from the different countries that he went to. It is said, quoting from the book, it is said that church growth among the Nishi tribe in India began when an important official's son died. So this was publicly known. Neither medicine nor sacrifices had helped the boy, but a pharmacist he knew had suggested a prayer to Jesus, the Christian God. So after his son dies, he's like, okay, well, maybe that is a good idea. He doesn't know what to do. The official laid his hand on the boy's head and promised to worship this Christian God if he would heal his son. The child's eyes opened and he recovered, resulting in hundreds of conversions in this region. He also said that in China, that when you go there, as many as 90, it's estimated that as many as 90% of the people in China that are in churches say they're in there because they had experienced a miracle themselves or someone they knew. They had seen one somewhere. The stories are not different. That leads to the second thing. He said the problem, though, is that most of what you find in the world is in other places besides the West, the United States and Western Europe. He goes so far as to say he's had so many interviews and he's studied so many things and seen so many reports that his estimate is there's not a few miracle stories out there. There's not thousands of miracle stories out there. He says, based on everything that he researched painstakingly, that the miracle stories out there number in the millions and millions and millions and millions. And his book is so thick because he's just reporting on hundreds of them, his eyewitness reports. But the problem is, they do seem to happen in other parts of the world. You see, we live in the post-Enlightenment age. We're in a scientific society. And without even realizing it sometimes, you and I, because we're from America, we have this built-in skepticism that's kind of built almost subconsciously in us. We're very skeptical about all those things. One Methodist bishop in Malaysia said this about the West. He said, Western theology invariably asks the question, are miracles possible? This, of course, addresses the Enlightenment problem of a closed universe. In much of Asia, that's a non-question because the miraculous is assumed and fairly regularly experienced. Another African theologian was a little more hard-hitting about the West. One African theologian said this, quote, nearly all African Christians and most African theologians, regardless of their views of other critical issues, reject Western anti-supernaturalism. Now, he acknowledges the existence of some false claims, but complains that it is arrogant and unprofessional for Western scholars to outright reject the miraculous, totally ignoring the testimonies of thousands of people based simply on their own lack of experience. That's kind of a heavy hit on us, isn't it? But they look at us and they say, we experience these things, but you can't dismiss them just because you don't, out of your skepticism. Again, millions and millions and millions of testimonies. And what Keener does, he says basically, here's how we typically handle miracles. He readily acknowledges that some are flat out fraudulent. Yes, there's a bucket that says fraud. He also acknowledges that some people exaggerate. A backache went to full-blown, disease. He also says that we know that sometimes psychology can just do things. Psychosomatic cures, you can be prayed for, and it was kind of all in your head anyway, and so it got better. But his point is, you can't take millions and millions and millions of stories and put them just in one of those three buckets. That's not logical, and it's intellectually really dishonest. Because especially stories like Barbara's are out there that don't fit in those buckets. So that's the case for, do these things really happen? And I would affirm that they do. And I would commend you, if you're really a doubter and really a skeptic, I would be more than happy to talk to you after you read Keener's book, okay? We can get together about a year from now, all right? Okay, so let's just imagine these things really do happen. The deeper question is, what does that mean for us? Like, as ambassadors, am I supposed to heal the sick, raise the dead, and all that? And here's my solid answer for all of you as your pastor. Yes and no, okay? Thank you very much. Glad I could help you with all the clarity. Go forth. Yes and no. And here's why I say no on one hand. The passage that we're looking at really is Jesus talking to the apostles, the original 12, and they had a special place in history and a special place in life. They were foundational, and their role was not going to be repeated in that way. And there's no question that Jesus gave them a special power or ability to do these things because he wanted to establish the church. So that's why it's a no. We're not exactly on that par, as it were. But here's the yes part. The apostles themselves always and readily acknowledged that God's power was available to God's people, no matter who you are. If you've come to Christ, you have the Holy Spirit within you. As a matter of fact, healings and miracles and stuff like that came up as just a regular part of the church. In 1 Corinthians chapter 12, it says this. The Apostle Paul is kind of listing off different gifts that are in the church. It says, and God placed in the church, first of all, apostles, second, prophets, third, teachers, then miracles, then gifts of healing, and then helping and guidance. You kind of threw it in there. It's like teachers and there's helpers, and there's miracles and healing. Just like, it treats it like this thing that's in the middle. It was a normal part of life. And so it's available to us as believers. You really can pray for people and see great things happen because in the millions, extraordinary things happen around the world. In China, South America, Africa, and all these places. Now that brings up a little harder question though. Why don't these things happen that much here? Now, please, make no mistakes. Our prayer teams have reported out some astonishing things. We've seen people healed. We've seen this kind of thing before. But you get the feeling when you look at other places in the world, it's just on a much more dramatic level. It just is. So why is that? And on this, I think the answer is there's a positive reason and a negative reason. Now, the positive reason, I could go back to the Old Testament. I'm just going to ask you to trust me. There's not time to read the passages. But there's a principle here. That when you go back and you study the Old Testament, there's one case where God leads the people of Israel out of Egypt. And they're in slavery, and they end up having to wander in the desert for 40 years. Now, it's hard to find food in the desert. So he feeds them. He literally feeds them miraculously through manna. They wake up every day, 6 days a week. 6 days a week, they wake up, and there's manna all over the ground. And they eat, and they do this for 40 years, miraculously fed them. But it literally says at one point when they crossed from the desert over to what he called the promised land, where he was taking them, it says, quote, the manna stopped that day. They never saw any more manna. And some of you, you're eating that stuff for 40 years, you're like, well, good riddance. I never have to eat manna again. But God goes on to say, I'm going to feed you through the abundance of that land. I'm going to feed you. There's going to be wells, there's going to be vineyards, there's going to be things. That's how I'm going to meet your needs. So it's not illegitimate at all to say, and I think it's a very good comparison, that there is such a thing. They say in Chinese villages, it is known, if you don't have a lot of access to medical care, which a lot of people don't have the kind of medical care that we do, it's known in villages that go find you a Christian out there somewhere if you can't afford it or can't find it, and they'll pray for you and you'll be better. That is just kind of a known thing in China, many areas. But we have good medical care. Jesus told us to pray for our daily bread, right? Well, I don't know how you do this, but you probably don't every morning. Oh, God, please give me my daily bread. Just bring it, just bring it, just bring it. And then you watch for manna to appear on your kitchen table. You probably don't do that. If you do that, I'd really like to meet you. Or probably not, But you don't do that, do you? How do you get bread? You just go down to the store and you get bread. So there really can be, but here's the flip side. Here's the negative thing, and I think this is partly what's happened. So in the West, we really do have that when it comes to medical care. The beauty of it is, by a Christian worldview, Christians in the West have been the primary drivers behind medical technology and hospitals. Hospitals were just a Christian thing that they pushed, and they continue to push. That's why so many hospitals are named after Christian things. But where we make the mistake is that we think just because it's not manna, it's ultimately not from God. And actually, God warns the people of Israel before they go in the promised land, here's exactly what's going to happen. I'm going to read you this one. This is from Deuteronomy 8. He's warning them right before they go over into the promised land. He says, be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God, failing to observe his commands, his laws, and his decrees that I'm giving you this day. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold increase, and all you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. He goes on to say, you may say to yourself, my power and my strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember the Lord your God, it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms his covenant, which he swore to his ancestors as he did today. Does that sound familiar? You see, what happens when we get things through so-called natural means, a Christian worldview is that there are no natural means, ultimately, that all things came from God. But what happens to us, and it's happened in the Western world, man, we're rich, we got medical care, we've got all these things taken care of, and so we do exactly what God predicted we would do. We would say, we don't even need him, and that's said out loud on university campuses all the time. Well, we don't need God at all. There's no use for him because we've all got it taken care of. And in many of these other countries, they don't feel that sense of self-adequacy. They're not tempted that way. They press into God in a major, major way. So I think that's one of the reasons that it happens. Now here's the thing. When I put all that together, though, and I was reading all the Keener stories and all the rest, and really, here's what I concluded, and I would challenge us all with. Expect more from God. God is doing remarkable, amazing, crazy, cool things all over the world. These stories are just going nuts out there. They really are, by the millions. And it's okay in a Western culture to expect more from God. I'm calling on One Life Church to expect more from God. Be bold to ask for greater things. Be bold to believe that God can and does heal people and does the miracle deal. He really does. But here's the flip side, and I'll show you why in a minute. Expect more from God, but know that it means pursue more of God. Expect more from God, but know that it means to pursue more of God. Now this gets us to, I think there's a hardship in everything that I'm talking about today. I think there's a source for some of even heartbreak. You might have heard that opening story and been, wow, that was amazing. And heard that millions of stories are going on all over the world. And God really does do miracles, because he really does. But I can picture people in my mind, I know in our church, that's a double-edged sword for them. Wow, that's awesome, that's encouraging. But don't we all have stories of why not the person I loved? He can, I know he does. He did remarkable things for Barbara. But why not my mom, my sister, my friend? Why? That's a harder one. But I just say it to you this way. Now, first of all, what encouraged me a lot when I was going through the hundreds of stories and things is people in other parts of the world readily acknowledge, even when we see miracles, they can tell miracle story after miracle story, they readily acknowledge there's this mystery that not everybody does get that. Not everybody does. It's not like a 100% deal. They can tell stories of the people that did not. And they're just as mystified by it. But it's not only people currently, it's people all, if you go back to the New Testament, the same kind of thing is there. There's this weird tension. The Apostle Paul, remember, this is an apostle. He raised the dead. He prayed for the sick. He did everything. He tells his friend Timothy at one point, in Timothy chapter 5, he says, stop drinking only water and use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. You're an apostle. You could have just gone up and gone, bzzz, or whatever it is you did, and healed him, right? But instead, he writes him a letter and said, hey, take some wine for your frequent illnesses. He's sick all the time. If I was his friend, I'd be like, dude, come on, a little wine, really? Thank you for the tip. He's talking to Timothy again, and he's listing off other people they both know. He says, greet Priscilla and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Erastus stayed in Corinth, and Trophimus sick. I left Trophimus sick in Miletus. I left Trophimus sick in Miletus. I left him. He was sick, and I walked away. Okay. Now, maybe he might, and you don't know that Paul didn't go, God, please heal this guy, and he walked away. He was still sick. He left him behind. They had that same tension existing inside the New Testament church, throughout history, and even now. So one, we can't let the tension of it all keep us from the ask, because somehow those parts of the world live within that paradox. But here's the other thing, and I'll go back to this. Expect more from God, but know that we really need to pursue more of God. I personally know a gentleman who was a leader in the Chinese underground church, and he told stories just like that. He saw the dead raised, he saw paralytics get up, blind eyes seeing, deaf ears hearing, the whole 9 yards. But he also told me this. He said, you know, in the Chinese church, when they have prayer meetings, a prayer meeting may last from about 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. the next day. And if we're all being gut level authentic here, in the United States, sometimes a prayer meeting can last from 6 p.m. to 6:15 p.m., right? He said, you'll go and you'll see all night where people are laying on the floor, crying out to God with everything in them to know God. You see, here's the thing. The purpose of prayer and the purpose of miracles is to know God. That's what it's for. It's a very disturbing and interesting and challenging thing when you go to Jesus' life. It says at one point in the Gospels about Jesus that he would go into these villages and amazing things were happening, stories just like we hear nowadays. You know, the deaf are hearing, the blind are seeing, and he would do all these amazing things. Then later on, he actually pronounces judgment on the places where he did most of his miracles. Because he said, if these miracles would have had happened somewhere else, people would have turned, people would have repented. But instead, I guarantee you what happened, because it's human nature. He calls down judgment on these people. You know what they probably did? Thanks for the miracle. I'm all set. I'm going to go back to, quote, my life. Too often, miracles are simply, we expect God to fix things. Well, I'm traveling along, God, you need to fix this problem. Thanks for fixing the problem. I'm going to go back to my life. And what miracles are always supposed to be are draws for us to know him. To know him. That's why he does them. And that's the purpose of prayer. So my advice, and I'm going to just get this in my own heart, is I'm going to ratchet up my expectation and my seeking for God to heal people miraculously. I'm just doing it. I am, because I'm convinced it happens around the world. It's something we can have by faith. I'm going to get bolder in my prayers about that kind of thing. I absolutely am. But here's also what I'm going to do. God help me to know whatever you want to do here, how it can help us to know you better. I've told the story before. I have a cousin of mine that has ALS, and that's Lou Gehrig's disease, for those of you who do not know. And he was normal as any of you. He was going along through his life, and late 40s, that kind of thing. And he was told, the doctor looked at him and said, you have a debilitating disease that will take your life eventually. It's going to break your body. Can you imagine? And he called over, as most of us would do. He and his wife found a very animated prayer group who were into healing, because usually that's what it is. The people, I want to find the people that really know how to do this. None of this, God, please heal him and walk away. I want the Chinese kind of all-night kind of prayers. He called them as you would. Now, what's interesting about him, he's the last kind of personality that would have done that under any other conditions. But when it came to the ALS deal, it was like, bring it on. Man, you guys can speak in tongues. You can do handsprings around my living room if you want to. I don't care. You just pray. And he said they did pray, and he said it was one of the most remarkable moments of his life. But what's interesting, he said, you know what? I didn't get my physical healing. I haven't had it yet. But he said, Brett, what I did get was there was something I had been wrestling with for years in my soul and in my heart, that I was set free at that moment. God set me free, and I know him like I've never known him before now. And he says, honestly, if my physical healing never comes, I will always look back to that moment as my true healing. And that's pretty profound. The purpose of prayer, the purpose of miracles is to know him. And my heart hurts deeply for all of you who have cried out and not seen anything happen. My only advice that I know how to be is remember Paul's words where he says, I want to know Christ in the power of his resurrection. That's healing. And what? And the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings. That's when those answers aren't there. That Jesus is the ultimate giver of hope, and we can believe that, but we hold those things in tension. But that's what it means to know him. I want us to pray together. Father, in Jesus' name, I come before you right now. And you know every weakness and every doubt and every frustration in the room. You know the why not me cries that are being made right now. You know the thank you. You know the inspiration. And I pray for us as a church body that we will more deeply believe you than we ever have, that you can and you will. In the power of your resurrection, you can and you will heal. And we can pray boldly. But give us the courage and the insight for how we can also know you in the fellowship of your sufferings. Help us to know you on the level that you really want us to. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.